Okay, go ahead. Wait, what? All right.
Okay.
Okay, now it now it should be recording. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Kiana.
Now we're good. All right. Well, I would like to, all right. I would like to welcome you all to our, yes, this is July, to our July wellness events. This is ADA perspective, the past and the future. So my name is Kiana Mayo. I am one of the social support specialists for this program, and the other social support specialist is Chris Nusbaum. And so for some rules, at the end, we'll have a question and answer segment. So if you have any questions, please hold them to the end. And before you speak, please say your name. And this program is provided by this event is provided by our COVID public health program. So I'll start with, so a little about our guests for today. So forgive me for shortening you all's bios. It took me about 20 minutes to read it all. So Janice Jackson is a dynamic advocate, educator, innovator, and motivator. For over 39 years, she has been an agent of change and recognized as one of the most prolific voices advocating for the rights of individuals with disabilities in Maryland. Janice joined the disability community in 1984 at the age of 24. After being struck by a car, Janice quickly realized that there was a lack of support for women with disabilities, where this is where her mission began. Janice is the founder and executive director of Women Embracing Abilities Now, WEAN, a nonprofit mentoring organization serving women and young girls with various degrees of disability throughout Maryland and the surrounding areas. The mission of WEAN is to wean a woman and young lady with disabilities from having their limitations be their focus point. Thus, WEAN seeks to empower and promote independence at its highest level, one-on-one and group mentoring relationships. WEAN also hosts yearly workshops, seminars, conferences that teach coping skills such as self-esteem building, self-care, health and wellness, community involvement, and advocacy. Janice has truly turned her tragedy into triumph, her struggle into success, and her commitment to life to embracing and empowering with disabilities. She believed through mentoring, each one can reach one. So, Mike Bullis, our second guest this evening, experience include 40 years in disability programming, services, and business ownership. He speaks throughout the country about the employment challenges facing Americans with and without disabilities. He has managed state and federal grant programs, as well as restaurants and service stations and a private mediation company. Mike began his career in Oregon, working at the Oregon Commission for the Blind, state director.
You're breaking up, Kiana.
and administrator of the governor's. I'm breaking up again. Can you
Yeah,
hear me good?
no, I
Okay.
got you.
All right. State services for all people with disabilities.
Hey,
Mike
Kiana.
moved to Merlin. From then, he has managed the
Continue.
Merlin. I'm still breaking up. Okay.
You are.
Since then, he
So
has managed.
go ahead and finish, Mike, and
I
then.
All
think
right.
you have to crawl up on your roof and you have to hold your tablet up over your head.
Go ahead and finish,
Have to
Mike,
close
if you
something out.
can, and then I.
Technology assistance. Okay. At the Department of Visuals at Blind Industry and Services of Merlin as the founding executive director of the Image Center for People with Disabilities. All right.
All right.
So, and then last but not least, Jim McCarthy has been blind since birth. He has nearly 30 years of disability public policy experience, in addition to a lifetime of lived disability experience. Jim began his career in the winter of 1997, providing benefits planning and assistance services in the Wisconsin nonprofit with the national representation for excellence. He provided counseling regarding the through available under the supplemental security income and programs, but also including food stamps benefits. The agency ran programs included vocational future planning, a project where enrollees meet a nursing level of care and we sought to provide. In November of 2011, Jim moved to Baltimore, taking his dream job with the National Federation of the Blind in its Office of Governmental Affairs. And with that, I will turn it over to Chris.
Okay, thank you, Kiana. We fought through it.
Yes.
Uh, so, and I'm grateful to our distinguished panel here for joining us to talk about the ADA and disability advocacy, both the past as we reflect on how far we've come, and also talking about where we are now and where we still have to go and how we're going to get there. We're coming up on the 34th anniversary of the signage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which will come on July 26th. The ADA was signed on July 26, 1990, which was a big milestone for the disability community because it was the most sweeping legislation to date that guaranteed the rights of people with disabilities in society, and our panelists can speak to that more. So the way that I'm going to do this, I think, is I'm going to ask some questions to start the conversation going among our panelists here, and then as any of the three of you say something, I just want to kind of keep it informal and interactive. So let's say, you know, if Janice says something that makes Mike think of something and Mike wants to comment on it, then Mike, go ahead and jump in, and we just want to keep the conversation flowing. So I have some questions written out, but I want to keep this informal. And then once we come to the end, once we have some discussion among the panelists, then we'll come to a time when all of us can ask questions of our panel. So I want to begin by talking a little bit about life before the ADA. A lot of us in the post-ADA generation, which is where I come from, kind of don't realize how good we have it, because we think about, yeah, there's plenty of times where things are inaccessible, but the ADA is a fallback because we have a lot of legal guarantees, and we can say, well, yeah, but this is in violation of this law, but that wasn't always the case. So I want to ask, what was the employment or educational or accessibility landscape, what have you, for people with disabilities, and why was the need for such legislation as the ADA so great? And I'll start with Jim on this, and then we'll just go from there.
I think the ADA wasn't the first of the important disability laws, and then after ADA, there have been much smaller, like the ADA covered a wide swath of society, but after ADA, the disability laws that there have tended to be smaller in scope. And I would argue a little bit that I think what was great, ADA took the reasonable accommodations idea from Section 504 of the Rehab Act and some other large concepts and made them more universal. And so basically after ADA, anybody with a disability, with a defined disability, had its potential coverage and its potential support. But I think one of the people, what the ADA did, I think, is kind of put a floor of protection and expectation. Like everybody was going to get a minimum. Pre-ADA, people got what they could negotiate. So I was going to college before the ADA, and I went to my school and asked for readers because my school had a lot, was a small private school, and they had my college, and basically Voc Rehab, which existed, wasn't timely paying my readers. So it's hard to get readers to read when they're not getting paid, especially when you promise that they'll get paid. And so the school did that, and they didn't have to. Like the 88, they weren't required to, but I negotiated that. I explained that what they wanted me to do well. But I was able to negotiate that. Not everybody would have, and like I say, the school wouldn't have had to do it at all. And the dean had a slush fund that he could do good things with, and he chose to do it. When I went to law school, it was post ADA, but not probably driven by the ADA. And I went to the dean of the law school and said, readers need to be paid, and I don't have the money to pay them. And she said, yeah, that makes sense to me. I understand. We have money. And the school again paid them. And that was in the end. So I think, and today's schools might not, because the ADA probably doesn't require it. So to some extent, I don't know that, like, what I think the ADA did the most, and I guess I'm a cynic, and others could, the ADA set up procedures of negotiation as people like procedures and kind of minimum standards, and people who are good negotiators probably get less, and people who have more trouble or are in more disadvantaged, challenging circumstances at least get a floor of basic services. So that's kind of my take on it. I don't know that it's
Well,
yeah.
yeah, Mike Bullis here. I guess, I remember speaking to a group on July 28th of 1990, 2 days after the passage of the ADA, and the question that came to me was, what effect does this law have? And my response was, it has the effect you have the power to make it have, because when any law is passed, people aren't familiar with the process. When any law is passed and signed by a president or signed by a governor, then the question becomes, are there regulations that are needed? And there are. And there are still some regulations for the ADA that have not ever been promulgated. Are there some things we could take to federal court? And there were, specifically dealing with Title III, which is the access to public accommodations for people. How was that going to work? What's the definition of a path of travel? Because businesses were under the obligation of, when they made modifications in their business, they had to modify the path of travel to the section where they were making the modifications. But that didn't necessarily mean that it went to the front door. It meant that they had to clarify or clear a path of travel. So I guess that's what I would say, is that the work really but the work really ramps up once a law is passed. You have to go then and enforce it. You have to get governors, and we've done that with the ADA for the last 35 years, whatever it is. We've done that with the ADA. We have literally gone state by state and court by court to get the ADA enforced. And it will be ongoing. We did some amendments to the ADA. Was that 2010 or 2011? Somebody can help me with that. But we wanted to go back and clarify some things because people were making strange interpretations of the ADA. So Congress came back and said, no, here's what we really meant. And we had a battle because some of the things that people wanted were not really part of the intent of the ADA. So I guess that's what I would say. The ADA is a sweeping law. But we are yet to see, for example, full internet access for people who use screen readers. There simply isn't. There aren't regulations that push businesses into doing that. There certainly are. We're certainly moving in the right direction. But every day there are cases in courts at the state and federal level that are testing what the ADA really is and what it can do for people. And then once we get one issue resolved, another one comes up. So it's an ongoing process, and it will go on forever, folks. We will be trying to clarify and organize the details of the ADA and how they affect us with disabilities and how they affect businesses and governments. We will be doing that forever. So when you pass quite enough.
Let me ask a follow-up to that, Mike. You and I both just came back from the National Federation of the Blind Convention, and of course there's a lot of talk there about the legislative and court advocacy that's been going on in the past year. And in some conversations I was having about that with some people who are new to disability, the kind of prevailing question was, well, why do you really even need to do this 30 years post ADA? Don't we even have a law? Don't we already have a law?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And it's a fair question. But look, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is still being litigated. Parts of it are still being litigated in terms of how it affects sexuality. Every law is going to get pushback, or it's going to get need for clarification. And that's just the way the law works. I think people are somewhat confused. They think that if you pass a law, you did your work, you're done. Go to the, go have a beer. You were great. No, that's not the way it works.
So, Chris, this is Jim again.
Yeah.
I was filling out some forms for medical appointments coming up, and my insurer is a large insurer, and they have an accessibility statement that says they'll provide me my benefit statements and all the different communications in a variety of formats. Braille is never mentioned. And as far as I can tell, Braille is not one of the formats that's available to
I
me.
wouldn't be surprised.
Now, I also I have the means to take their formats. I have a Braille printer, a Braille embosser. I have the means to put it in Braille. I don't personally necessarily benefit from Braille. Braille, a lot of people who are blind and visually impaired don't know it. There may be a lot of reasons that what they're doing is legal, but there are a lot of blind people in the world who would get the most benefit out of those statements if they were in Braille.
Yeah.
So that's an example. I'm not sure, and it's kind of Mike's point. Are they violating the ADA? There also might be some HIPAA, some privacy laws that but they've got really high-end lawyers, and their ADA statement says basically. And a couple of weeks ago when I saw it, I was like, interesting. And I saw it again. I'm like, is it? And it's Mike's question. If we think they are, if enough people think that it is a violation, they'd have to take it to court. They'd have to go to court. And sometimes we have over the 30 years.
Well, and I think
let
the
me-
other thing is,
yeah.
if you look at the Title III of the ADA, which really was the game changer in so many ways for people with mobility concerns. We've come a long way, but not fully away. And maybe I want Janice to talk about that some, for access to restaurants, access to public spaces and places.
Right.
You might find that your government is doing a good job in many ways. But however, you may not find that the local restaurant down the street is accessible, and what are your options? Well, your options are go in and picket the hell out of them and embarrass them into doing it, or your options are to sue. There are options, but Janice, maybe you could talk about that, because I don't fully embrace all of that, because I've never been in a wheelchair and I've never had to fight through this issue.
Mike, I've been in the disability community 40 years, but I was introduced way before I entered the community. And 6 years into my disability is when the ADA was passed. And some of the same issues pre and post ADA are the same. And I think one of the problems is the accountability mechanism. And that limits us because, you can have laws on the books, but unless there's power behind those that are benefiting from these laws, and, as you said, we've come a long way, but we have a long way to go. And I
So
think,
Janice, let me ask you a question. If you have an answer for it, compared to 1984 and 2024, in 1984, what percentage of the public places, restaurants, et cetera, that you wanted to go to were accessible in 84, and what percent are accessible now?
I would say about 20% back in 84. And now we're not 100%, but we're close to, I would say about 80, 85, Mike.
Yeah. So we've made real
And
progress.
So that's
That's
and a
good
lot
progress.
of
It's
it, I
still not
think,
where you want to be, but it's good
no,
progress.
but we moved the can. And I think due to advocacy and doing to those in our community, stepping up and letting their voices be heard. I'm an advocate. Once the ADA was passed, it became part of my DNA. And you guys have known me a long time. And through advocacy and teaching and training, because you can sit back and complain all you want, but until we put fire behind our complaints and make sure they don't fall to the ground, and I see a lack of that more and more, Mike, of getting people trained and giving them knowledge of the ADA. And I think a lot of people living with disabilities don't even understand the ADA. They know what the law, they know we have a law and we have civil rights, but I would love to just poll those of us with disabilities to see how much they really know about the ADA laws.
So
and
is that where Janice, well, okay, I got two questions for you on two different subjects, but you brought up a good point, so I'll ask you this question first. Is that where the consumer organizations, the advocacy organizations in the community, and CILs like ours come in? Is that where the importance of those organizations, to where you do the education, you do the advocacy together, is that where you think those come in for the education and the and the advocacy purposes?
absolutely. And ADA should not just be mentioned on the anniversary. I think, you know, ideas and laws perish because of lack of knowledge. If people don't know and they're not properly trained, then, how can they go forth and really fight for, fight for their rights? I think education should be on so many levels, not just with grassroots organizations, but on all levels. Government, you have training at work, you have training, you have workshops. So how much training is given to the ADA and the rights of people with disabilities?
So I have a follow-up, if I could.
Sure, Jim.
People like in your say Image Center, or I think of working at Maryland Technology Assistance Program before. People with disabilities come to us with a particular need. I need housing now, or I need some workable technology, or I need, and that's usually how they come to the doors of organizations. How do you, at that moment, they don't much care about the ADA. They care about having a house or having a,
right,
or whatever. How do the agencies move from, because I agree with you, but move from, okay, we can help you with this service, and you'll, while we're helping you with this service, we're going to teach you to fish a little bit so that you can be empowered later.
Yeah.
I
think that happens to one extent or another. Certainly at the Image Center, Centers for Independent Living are constant advocates for making sure that people understand their rights under the ADA. And you're right, Jim, it does get focused on what's my problem right now, because frankly, if you talk to people about too big of a picture, they don't understand it, number one, and number two, they're usually in a trauma situation where they absolutely need something, like you say, housing or food or other things, and they're not gonna welcome a nice lecture on the ADA particularly, but they do hear that word and they do hear that name a lot. And so over time, the advocates do, we are creating new advocates. It just takes time. I mean, look, I'm always fascinated by how things change. I think, Janice just said 85% of restaurants and public spaces are accessible now. Look, when 1990 rolled around and ADA was passed, there was a lot of hostility in the business community. There was a lot of hostility everywhere in the process. But, once you start building the building codes, I went and worked with a bunch of building codes people. If you want to talk about something boring, have a look at building codes. And yet, once you get that law implemented at the building codes level and the inspectors are going out to buildings and saying, hey, well, excuse me, you can't do this. You can't do this because you haven't provided wide enough doorways, or you haven't provided wide enough aisles. And then businesses started waking up. And I don't think for the most part now businesses are particularly angry about the ADA because they see money.
Mhm.
They see customers who are spending money.
One other question I want to ask Janice about building accessibility was, I wonder if you've noticed, Janice, whether it's dependent on the area that you go. And the reason I ask this question is from personal experience. I live down on the Eastern Shore now, and I have gotten to know a guy who lives in a wheelchair, or who uses a wheelchair, I should say, and lives in the Ocean City area. And he said he can only go to about half the places on the Ocean City boardwalk. Only about half of them are accessible to him. And I was kind of surprised by that, for as popular as the boardwalk is, and as much of a kind of tourist trap as it is, you would think that there would be more of it that's accessible. So I'm wondering if you've noticed, more areas than others that are accessible.
Well, I think the area may have something to do with it, but a lot of businesses have exceptions as far as how many employees they have. I think if they have 15 or more, they have to um, abide by the ADA rules. If you have less than, Mike, I don't know what the number is, but
Yeah, no, you're
there's
right. You're
Yep.
right. It's 15 or
there's
more.
certain restrictions on businesses that they get around the ADA regulations. So like the boardwalk, I haven't been there in so long, but a lot of those are really small business owners, and they don't meet the regulations of having to,
Well, and they're
have
old businesses.
right.
They've
And
been
I'm
there.
not even exactly. Some of them may be historical buildings where you can't go in and make modifications. So it just depends on that as well. But Rose is on the line. She lives on the Eastern Shore, and we talk a lot about the accessibility on the Eastern Shore, the rural areas of Maryland,
Oh yeah.
and 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 she can tell you they've got a ways to go down there, huh, Rose?
Yes, definitely. Yes, definitely. And I agree with you. The boardwalk it should be, it's a unique thing, and there are more people go there than everywhere else. Even though the businesses are small and they're small, that's where a lot of tourists go. So that's a limitation in the ADA. That's something that, even though it requires 15 employees or whatever, that's a limitation there that you can, over the country, there's probably a lot of more limitations there that are in effect. And of course, where it's a rural area down here on the shore, the transportation is just atrocious.
Oh, tell me about it. Where do you live, Rose?
I live in Del Mar, which is
Oh
close to
yeah. Oh
Salisbury.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and
This
it's
is
important. It's important to know that one of the provisions in the ADA is that the only time a business has to make modifications is if they are remodeling or and something. So if they never remodel, if they never change it, The only obligation they have is to provide their service to people who can't get in. In other words, they would have to go out and deliver food to people out on the sidewalk or whatever who needed it. So there is that part of the ADA, but as far as modifying their physical site, they don't have to.
Mhm.
And I think the follow-up too, Mike, is a lot of the ADA is driven on reasonable accommodation. So the thing, my thing about Braille before, it may be that if I want to read my insurance statements in Braille, that I can read them online in several other ways. There's a whole bunch of choices. That may be, though, even if it's not what I want or even what I think is best for me, that may be what I get. Reasonable accommodation doesn't mean my accommodation, like the thing I would ask for.
Yeah.
That's part of the calculus, but it's not the calculus.
Now, Jim, I was looking over your bio that you sent us, and I'm not sure if Kiana read this part, and she just broke up during this time. But you mentioned in the longer bio that you sent us that you were maybe not involved in, but you observed the famous and really pivotal protests in San Francisco. The late Judy Heumann was involved in that. Your old boss from NFB, Jim Gashel, was involved in that, I think.
I don't know if
So
Jim was out there.
Oh, really?
I don't know
Okay, I
that he
thought
was. I don't know that he was out there. And I was
Okay.
actually, to be honest, Chris, I was 12 years old at the time. I was in the sixth.
Okay.
What I kind of meant was a lot. It in my childhood up to I was 25 when the ADA was enacted. So from in my youth, in my kind of youth to transition period, most, if not all, of the kind of fundamental disability legislation was enacted.
Right.
And,
Okay.
after ADA, not that much. Help America Vote Act has some
Right.
significance. ABLE is, ABLE
Yeah.
is helpful, but I mean, there's some, but after the ADA, it's been more aspects of larger laws that impact the disability community,
So-
or maybe parts
And-
of the community.
And maybe
And so
what I
that's
was-
what I meant.
What
And
I was
maybe-
gonna what I was gonna ask about the San Francisco protest, just because I don't know much about them and I don't know if anybody else does, is what were those about and what impact do they have on the larger advocacy moving forward?
To my understanding, and Mike may want to, they were about, so like the notion of reasonable accommodations really comes out of the Rehab Act, comes out of Section 504 of the Rehab Act, and in Section 501 was a kind of a affirmative action. 501 and 503 were hiring of people and providing accommodations in the federal government, because at that time there weren't that many. We now think of the government, of the federal government, as a place quite friendly to people with disabilities. I work in the federal government, and they're good salaries and stuff like that. But at that time, there weren't a lot of people working in the government, and there so these provisions came, and then the regulators, the federal regulators, didn't put up regulations. And like Mike said, I mean, the regulations are going to evolve for the rest of time. They're going to change here and there, and they're going to be battled. But basically, Section 504 was and a lot of, most laws are not very useful without a regulatory scheme. So as I understand it, the fight was, okay, we've got this law, but then the people who were supposed to tell us what it meant, basically sat on their hands and didn't do anything.
That's right. That's right. It was a battle over trying to force the federal government to release regulations for Section 504, and ultimately that battle was won. But
that was one. Yep.
that was what was the fight, and it is definitely it's definitely a different world back then in terms of people and their receptivity to having people in the workplace, having people doing any kind of accommodations for people who needed them when they, and many of the buildings, federal government and other government buildings, were not accessible to people with disabilities. If you wanted to get help, pretty much, stand out on the street corner and try and get their attention.
So we're at 2:46 now. I have a final question I'm going to ask at the end, but I'll open it up now to questions from everybody and just an open conversation with our panel. If anybody wants to ask questions or comments, if you want to come off mute, just say your name so we can recognize you, and then you can go ahead and ask your question.
I would say, by the way, before we get our first question, one of the precursor laws to the ADA that is still one of the most powerful laws on the books and is Public Law 94. I think it's 94-142, which provided for IEPs in schools and which provided for making accessibility. Yes, it's still a hit and miss process to this day. People don't get the services that they need, but there's massive amounts of progress that were made, and that law was passed before the ADA.
So one of the things that I said in my bio, and I don't think it came up, but I was in 1975. I was in, I guess I would have been like sixth grade, fourth grade, probably in 1975. But in eighth grade, I remember actually I went to a school for the blind, and I actually got to go and was invited to my IEP. And I thought this was an incredible advocacy opportunity. And the principal made some assertions about my misbehavior, and I had misbehaved, but I was able to argue and say, and I did that, principal, your assertions aren't correct. And my mom backed me up, but that was really felt empowering to me. It's like, I was like, yes, I misbehaved, but your assertions aren't full. And for me, that was a really strong, formative advocacy moment, and it was made possible by IDEA. I didn't even know that at the time, but I just knew I got to go to these meetings.
And that's important. That's important. Students being able to go to their own IEPs, where they're, I remember reading a poem that a student wrote one time about their IEP, and the line kept repeating, "After all, they're talking about me."
Yeah. Yeah. There are still far too many IEPs that are written without the involvement of the student, even though they claim there are. But we've come a long way.
Yeah. All right. So
Anybody
what
have
questions do we have?
This is Rose Carey.
Hey.
Hi, everyone. We talked a little bit. I used to work at Holly Center, and I was just sitting here thinking the developmental disability community has come a long way in Maryland too, because a lot of people have been integrated into the community that would not have otherwise been. I think there's only 2 centers left in Maryland now that have developmental disabilities. And that's Holly Center and Potomac. So that they've come a long way in that respect too.
And that was part of the same. That was part of the same kind of has been part of the same effort in a way. I mean, not ADA, but the idea of deinstitutionalization and inclusion and those kinds of notions.
Over the years, I've been a part of a lot of ADA programs, ADA education, training, which I think is the key to, and I'm gonna come back to this. I keep coming back to the education. Mike, Jim, and I, we are the voices from the past, and the voices of the future as we move on in our movement. I feel has got to get stronger. We I just think we just need to really get a hold of our movement in some kind of way and put fire under it. Just like Judy Heumann and those who fought to get us to the ADA point. We have to rev it up to get to the next point of enforcing the ADA. There's no ADA police. There's no, someone actually monitoring, the progress of it. But those of us with these lived experiences that face still the laws that are not being enforced. But I think it starts with our community. These young people that are entering our community or in our community. We have to have someone to pass the torch to. And being out in the community and doing a lot of mentoring and trying to get people involved in this movement. It's really hard now, and I don't know why there's a pushback. And those of us, I don't know if people got complaints with that when someone else will take care of it. I'll complain to myself, but I don't want to get out there on the front lines. So I just, I want to end this. Chandra, are you on the call? I hope I don't put you on the spot.
I am on the
She
call.
just won a lawsuit. And, yes, she's Miss Wheelchair America and all of that, but she just won a lawsuit in New York, going to a parade, and she came up against something and she fought it and she won the lawsuit. And, these are the kind of young people that we need to just take the torch and keep going with it. So could you share just a little bit? We only have a few minutes, but just the gist of what that case was.
Sure. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I was asked to lead the Disability Pride Parade in New York. And of course, I'm from Maryland, born and raised. And so I wasn't familiar with the landscape. I think someone mentioned it before that when you go to different places, it's different. So New York, there's like very small buildings and so forth. So I had to stay in a hotel, and the hotel was right next to the train because I was using the train to get back and forth. And this hotel, I called and told them what I was looking for, and they promised that their rooms were accessible, but it was the opposite. It was actually a death trap. I mean, the bathroom didn't have enough turning radius. There was no grab bars, just a host of problems to the point where even the door was more than 10 pounds heavy that I had to call to the hotel to get them to open the door. It was like I was in an adult timeout. So all of those problems and the safety issues, I felt like me writing a strong letter wouldn't make them change all of those rooms because they said every single one looks just like that. So I end up getting a lawyer and I sued that hotel so that they can change those rooms so the next person that comes that is a wheelchair user won't experience the things that I experienced.
And she just got the results that she wanted. And this is the future. Right. And this is the future. You
Thanks.
know, we need those strong voices. We need those, you know, those that are going to step up and not only complain, but do something about. But when she told me that, you know, I'm like, well, this is what all this is about. This is what it boils down to. Our voices, and, you know, making them stronger and teaching people how to exercise their voice to make a change. And so I thought that was that gave me an incentive of just keep on trying to just train people and mentor people and making a change. You know, we've come, like Mike said, we've come a long way, but we have some ground to cover. We still have some ground to cover.
Yep.
So
Congratulations, Chandra. And I think that it's important to note, I'm sure Janice has told you this, but I think it's important to say that when one person wins a victory like you did, that's a victory for all of us.
yes.
Amen.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So congratulations to you and congratulations to us.
Good job.
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
So what other questions do we have?
This is Terry. I find that educating young people with disabilities, it's a little more difficult to recruit them to get involved. Is there a way to expedite that? Anybody has any ideas?
Well, I told you, Terry, my last hurrah, hopefully before, you know, I do like Mike and retire, but Mike is not retired. He just moved physical locations. He's not retired. But you know, I want to start an academy, a training academy for young individuals with disabilities. I think I ran this across you, Mike, and a few other people to train these young people about the ADA, train these young people about running a meeting, sitting on a commission, Robert's Rules of Order. Get these young people trained. So when people come to you asking, do you know anybody that want to sit on my board? Can you recommend someone to sit on this commission? We have young people ready to fill these slots because, you know, the same voices from the past, Mike, me, Jim, Terry, we've been at this so long.
Yeah.
You know, but we've got to have somebody like Chandra to just
take the torch.
That are trained, not just someone that wants their name. Well, I was appointed by the governor. I sit on this. Someone is going to put in the work, put in the time to really make a difference. Because again, we can't drop the torch. Those that came before us, they worked hard to get us here. So we have to keep the momentum of passing it on.
And I would say this.
Thanks.
Go ahead, Mike.
I would say this. I get presented with opportunities to serve on committees, commissions, and all kinds of things. And sometimes they just want a disability representative on there so it makes them look good. The first thing I always ask, and it's the important question, is if I joined this organization, what authority would I have? Because, you know, organizations, governments, they love to have people on committees and as advisors, advisory committees, which really means we want you to advise us and then we're going to do whatever the hell we wanted to do in the first place. I don't serve on those committees unless I just decide that I want to go have a fight. But I have been a strong advocate ever since I was in my 20s for the fact that if you want me on your local transportation committee, you tell me what is there some way that, for example, I might have that our committee might have final approval over new transportation regulations that you're writing? Or can we, do we have the right to stop them? What input are we going to have into the process? So all I can say is
Absolutely.
know your power.
Well, and I think, and you're right, Mike. I mean, there are people with disabilities can spend, and it's good practice to learn, but we can spend what would be our working lives on committees, going to meetings and, on committees, because there's a space for, I was on my first committee. It was a city committee. It was pre-ADA. I went to one and I realized they just needed, basically it was a disability committee in the city I grew up in. The ADA was close to being enacted, so they wanted to show that they were thinking about things. So they created a committee, and I was a college student and knew somebody. I think I knew the chair of the committee, and I was put on it. It had no authority. I had no authority. It was a huge waste of time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Janice. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Chris.
And Terry, if I might step out of my role as moderator for a second and share some experience.
Good.
I kind of cut my teeth. So my training in advocacy, which has led me now to the job I have, started as a student, started in what you're talking about. I was on the board of the Maryland Association of Blind Students for several years, served as president of that organization, was on the board of the National Association of Blind Students, did a bunch of other things. So I did the stuff that Janice was talking about, and now I'm on the other side of what she's talking about. And so I think it has to do with just my perspective. I think it has to do with making sure that you strike that balance between making the thing that you want people to join relevant to the people you're looking to train, and something that is that makes them interested, while also keeping the message and the principles true, staying true to those core values. And sometimes that means that, with all due respect to the people here, and I think you all will understand this, and sometimes it means that the young people have to say to the old timers, hey, if you want to get some young people involved, we might have to do some things a little differently.
Well, that brings up a question for me, Chris, because it comes up sometimes I've heard it come up in ADA meetings over my time, and it is that the leaders won't get the hell out of the way so young people so new people can do it, because after all, I've done this for 30 years and I know the answers.
Well,
and if I don't move, that might mean
I don't necessarily, and I know some young people want them to just get out of the way. For me, I don't necessarily want them to get out of the way, because I know I can learn a lot from them. What I want them to do is work together with the young people, and for the young people to be open to learning and being learning from and being mentored by the older people, while the older people could be open to maybe doing things in ways that could make things relevant to and more palatable by people who are younger than them. I know this is super vague, but I'm just trying to kind of talk in more broad terms, and then if you want to be more specific, we can talk after. But yeah, and the other thing I would say about the point that I think it was oh, I'm sorry, it was either Mike or Jim made a point about I'm sorry, it went out of my head now, so it must not have been an important point for me to make. But there was something to do with training for something to do with training for advocacy. But anyway, I guess what I would say is that there's a balance that needs to be struck between making between being able to pass on the torch while also being mentored by each other.
And I found over the years, sometimes just your presence makes a difference. For instance, my children went to a school, the local school, and during American Education Week, I couldn't get to their classroom because it was downstairs. And that entered me in a whole new realm of let's make the school system buildings accessible. It took years and years, but it opened a lot of eyes.
Yeah. And I think what's also important is
oh man, Kiana,
your connection is not
Kiana,
good.
is that we have to have a role to play, and that you can't.
I can't hear either.
I don't know what is wrong.
Yeah,
that
you
you
can't.
oh gosh.
You didn't hear what you said.
Yeah. We can see you.
This is Stephanie. I'm gonna jump in for a half a sec. Kind of going back actually to the education, the training, getting our youth to be involved and to take that torch. Going back to what Jim said, years ago with his IEP, that first simple step where he had a moment to get his thoughts across, to express himself in that IEP meeting. That was an eye-opening moment. Kids these days need and get actually these little moments, and all these little moments add up to them being more empowered because they see
absolutely
little steps at a time. I love watching the students that we have that go through the doors pre-ets class. That's what we talk about is self-awareness, self-advocacy. And some of these kids have been exposed to it, some of them haven't, but they all have a little bit more once they leave something as simple as a 5-week session. And as long as we keep bringing these things to them, no, we're not going to reach all of them, but you are going to trigger some that say, hey, wait a minute, this is important to me, and I have a voice. And that's what we got to just keep doing. Other than asking for more money and getting it so that we can actually reach out to all these kids. But, every little bit helps.
I remember the point I was going to make now, and it was in response to Mike's point about advisory committees. When I was in college, our dean of students had put together something called the Student Diversity Council, which was supposed to be a board that consisted of a representative of each minority group on campus. And it was appointed by the dean of students. So he appointed me as the representative of students with disabilities. Well, for one thing, that was a pretty broad thing to do, because how was I supposed to represent all disabled students on campus? Well, I could try. But I got in there, and Mike, I wish that I would have known the question that you asked back then, because there were times when we would get so far into other conversations, which were, for the record, important, about other diversity conversations, things about, racial diversity issues, or, you know, things about other things. And sometimes it would make me wonder, why am I here? And I finally talked to our chairman about that. And I said, Dean Smith appointed me to this position to represent students with disabilities, and it seems like we're talking about everything else but that. And she, to her great credit, and we're good friends, listened to that and changed things accordingly. But sometimes you just kind of have to put your foot in the door. And so, yeah, we just kind of, there's a book about blindness advocacy called The Unseen Minority. And sometimes people with disabilities are kind of relegated to that status, even within diversity spaces. So, yeah, I ended up being vice chair of the Student Diversity Council in my senior year, but that wasn't without its share of challenges and kind of an uphill climb.
Well, and I'm a great believer in taking on your own authority. I've been on some of these councils where they don't essentially have any authority whatsoever, but it's just an advisory group. And I have said to these committees over the years, look, let's pass a motion opposing the new processes that the administration is putting into place. And people have said to me, well, we can't do that. I said, you can do anything you want to. They don't have to listen to you, but let's put it on the record what we think, and let's not be shy about it. And let's make it clear to the public and other students what we think about it. Even though they started you out as an advisory committee, if you take your own power and if you push that power to the limits, sometimes, by the way, you'll just be removed from the committee. That's happened to me before. I always considered that a compliment. But you have to be willing, I think, to take your own power and use it.
Well, again, Mike, I think that goes back to training and helping people find their voice. A lot of them have it, but they don't know how to exercise it, and finding that balance of being assertive and not being aggressive or passive. I mean, all this is training. These are skill sets. And that's why I say the training, on some degree, everybody's not born like you and me with big mouths. And, we demand a presence, when we get our point across. And you're absolutely right. Anybody can get a seat at the table. But does that seat have a mic? Does that seat, have a place where you can freely speak, and agree to disagree, and have them understand that we've been silenced too long. Too long.
When I started working for the National Federation of the Blind, Jim Gashel, who some people on this call know and many probably don't, he said, Jim, you'll go to a lot of meetings in this job. I was governmental affairs and whatever. And he said, you'll go to a lot of meetings. And he said, I will be disappointed if the word comes back that you went to a meeting and said nothing.
Yeah.
He said, say something, say one thing at a meeting. And he's like, and don't just talk to talk, say something that matters, that moves the course of discussion. And if I hear you didn't, I'm going to be disappointed. And that was probably one of the biggest takeaways I got from, I think that, I mean, you might not, maybe you resign if, you're on the committee, it turns out you can't do anything. But, the first thing is that you articulate what people with disability, what your constituents need or want. Or, you may not be heard. And if you're not heard, then maybe you leave because your time could be better spent somewhere else.
I guess the other piece of advice I have is go in before the meeting and get to know the fellow members and stay after the meeting so that you can get to know the people that you're working with, because that's where you build those coalitions and that's where you build those. And so I'm pretty skeptical of Zoom meetings, frankly, because what ends up happening is you don't get into the meeting until the meeting starts, and then once the meeting's over, everybody's gone. I don't think that works because you're not building those connections with your fellow committee members.
Yeah. Let's get 2, maybe 3 more questions if there are any.
Well, this is Kiana. Can you hear me now?
Hey, that's much
Oh,
better.
yeah.
All right. So what I was saying was, I think we have to get young people to realize that they have more power than they think, and that we all have a role to play. You know, if you're kind of what Janice was saying, if your strong suit isn't speaking in front of a crowd, you know, maybe it's emailing, but they have to get in the game. Essentially, like, you're not going to make change from your couch. You have to like get in the game and really create the world that you want to see.
That's exactly what I was talking about also, Kiana. Thank you.
It really is the truth. You know, and I think different generations have different ways of approaching and I mean, this can be in the disability community as well as non-disability. You know, we're more in a me, I generation now. And, you know, us in the older generation, you know, as you said, Kiana, when we got in the fight, when we put our dog in the fight, it was for everybody. It wasn't just for me. So that change I'm fighting for is not just for Janice Jackson. It's for our community. So I think if we get more focus on us as a community instead of I, you know, I think we could get that unity back and be united to way other minorities are. These other movements that are so on point. I mean, their voices are heard, you know, and I think we need to, you know, work at getting to be unified and get our voices to be amplified on a much larger scale, because, you know, this is just from what I'm observing, you know, the zest and the zeal of our fight is being lost, and I don't know what all the answers to get it back, but
I
yeah.
wonder though, this is Jim. I think, I mean, I guess one thing Chandra, that I used to tell people, like I've had a lot of opportunity where people might have a legal case, you know, ADA case or whatever. And I always thought that it was my job to say, this case is going to take you 2 or 3 years, probably. A lot of people, including maybe your family or, you know, lots of people maybe that you're close to, are going to tell you you're an idiot for doing it. Why can't you just, I think it takes a lot. My point is it takes a lot of sacrifice to do what, you know, it takes maybe more personal sacrifice than you might have even realized before you started it. There's the wrong, I can't get in, I have to call for help, I have to, and then there's the, I'm going to do this. And it's really courageous that you took it on, and that, you know, and wonderful that you won, although that probably wasn't guaranteed. So I think there's a lot of sacrifice in that kind, you know, in being a, you know, a party to a lawsuit or something. That
Absolutely, Jim. You know, but I look at, you know, the civil rights movement and all these movements that actually require blood, lives, sweat, and tears for the cause, you know, and anything worth fighting for, you're going to have to give up something. Your time, your resources, and I think that's where a lot of people, I don't know, the barriers to keeping them from going all in. Kiana and I on a lawsuit, we've been on, it seems so long, and yeah, it gets discouraging, but we're trying to look at the bigger picture for our community. So it does, you're right. You're absolutely right. It does take effort and time and sacrifice, but it's for the greater cause, it's for the bigger picture. And
Well,
I don't know.
that's a great example. Wasn't it 2018 that we began the lawsuit against the city for accessibility?
Yes.
So we're at it for 6 years.
Oh, 6 years, right?
And we're fighting, and we're trying to come to, it's a lot. It's a lot. It is a lot. But hopefully what we get out of it, Mike, and we're working towards some stuff that we will make it better for the masses. Yeah.
Well, the city's very clearly being obstructionist in this whole process.
Yes.
They delay and they delay and they obfuscate and they lie, and it's just it's sad to watch.
Yeah.
Well,
but they got the right ones, don't they, Kiana?
Yeah.
Yes, they do.
Well,
They
everybody,
got the right one.
we're over time, and our captioner just sent me a message in the chat that said that she's going to have to leave soon. So let me just wrap this up. This has been a wonderful discussion, and I think it's just the beginning of a conversation that is going to continue throughout many years to come, because as all of us have pointed out, we're not even close to done yet. So Janice, Mike, Jim, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation, and thank you all for asking questions. This has been a great discussion, and I hope we'll do it again next year, if not before.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you for the invitation so much.
You are so welcome. I second that, Chris. This is a great discussion.
And next time, everyone bring a friend.
Yes.
Yes.
Right.
Yep.
Thank you.
Good
Right.
discussion, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Have a great day.
You too.